Okay, this lecture is over Module 16 of your curriculum entitled Network Security and Fundamentals. Okay, in the first section, it's always why should we take this module? And the short version of what's there is to learn how to secure your network and devices that are on your network. In particular, you'll be learning about the different types of security threats and vulnerabilities. You'll talk about network attacks. We'll talk about how to mitigate those attacks, and then we'll talk about device security in addition to the network and network components. So your curriculum talks about 4 types of threat. The one that comes up here is information theft. So this is stealing confidential information. It may be information that's sold. It may be proprietary information about research or products, or maybe even a customer list, all of which could be used to damage a company's business. Data loss and manipulation would be attacks where they just outright destroyed data or they manipulated that data. Manipulation might be changing the price of an item, paying somebody's pay rate, changing the amount on a bill, for example. The next is identity theft, where somebody is trying to gather enough information to impersonate you so that they could get IDs or maybe credit cards or gain access to things like your bank account. Identity theft is a huge problem. Here they say that it costs billions of dollars per year. Straightening that up or covering losses that were created by identity theft. And then the last one that's discussed is disruption of service, or a lot of times called denial of service. And basically what a denial of service attack is trying to flood a server, for example, with so many packets and or invalid packets, or not doing the TCP handshake correctly to cause the web server not to be able to serve up web pages. And therefore there could be damage to your reputation, or if it's a website that sells things, there may be a loss of sales. The next thing that your curriculum talks about is the types of vulnerability. Basically, vulnerability means a weakness in the network or a device on the network in our case. And the first thing they talk about is technology vulnerabilities. So we use operating systems on our end devices. We use iOS on our Cisco network devices. There may be vulnerabilities or weaknesses or bugs or flaws in those operating systems. A lot of the things that we send, like if we use Telnet or HTTP or FTP, they're inherently insecure because the data is not encrypted. We talked about that before. So instead of HTTP, you would use HTTPS. Instead of FTP, you would use SFTP. Instead of Telnet, you would use SSH, which are all encrypted methods of talking. And then I've already mentioned this, I believe, but the network equipment has firmware and or operating systems that may have problems. Also, all these things have passwords, so if you are not thoughtful in setting passwords or password restrictions, people may be able to break into those devices. Another thing people don't often think about is physical security. One thing I tell my people in where appropriate in class is if you can physically touch a machine, you can break into it. If your password has a BIOS supervisor, administrator, password. If you can open the case, you can get in there and you can short pins out or change jumpers, depends upon the motherboard. But you can basically make it forget those passwords. Um, on a router, if you hacked into a router, you could there's a flag you can set. You can reboot the router, and then you're basically the administrator. Doesn't ask you for a password. Um, Another thing that you may not think of is electrical threats. This is power with the electrical system. Either you don't have enough power, which would be a brownout. Uh, maybe a transformer blows up or a car hits a power pole. There may be a voltage spike, both which can damage the machines. Uh, you can have what's referred to as unconditioned or noisy power, where the voltage fluctuates. And of course, if you totally lose power, then you're going to have some problems unless you have an uninterruptible power supply, which will allow you to keep those machines up for some point in time. And if you're not going to be keep them up as long as you'd like, you can at least correctly shut them down instead of them just flipping off the power. Here we have what's referred to as a man trap. Can't remember if we talked about this before. I think maybe I was talking about it recently in 111. But basically, you have something like maybe a badge swipe or entering of a code that would get you through the first door. Once you were in this room, you might have to sign in, or a guard make sure you have access to the machine room. To get through the second set of doors, this door has to close, and then you have some other mechanism, maybe a thumbprint reader or something like that, to get through the second door. So it's multi-factor authentication, with a security guard or an employee supervising access. And then in the machine room, we have servers, we have networking equipment, we have air conditioning to keep it at an appropriate temperature, and we have a UPS, uninterruptible power supply. Also, there may be security cameras that are there. Okay, next section is a check your understanding over the security threats and vulnerabilities that we have talked about. You can do that on your own, and we will move on to the next section, which is on network attacks, and primarily talks about malware. In the first section, that would be your viruses, your worms, your Trojan horses. Viruses are pieces of code that tack themselves onto other code or infects that code. That's why they're referred to as a virus. Sharing a virus takes an action such as clicking on a link, double clicking on an attachment in email, something like that. That's why people say be careful what you click on. Make sure you know and trust the source of the email. Worms are similar to viruses, with the exception that they can propagate themselves through the network on their own. So once they infect one computer, they start searching around for other computers that they can infect as well and spread out the infection. Trojan horses are something that appears as one thing but is really something else. They're named after the Trojan horse, or the horse of Troy. They tried to break into the city of Troy, and it was a walled city, and they could not break in. So what they did is they left a big wooden horse outside the gate, and basically, I think, were admitting defeat. And the people of Troy wheeled the horse into the city, and the city was full of soldiers who then came out of the horse and attacked them. Um, Here's an animation that basically we have a bad guy, sometimes referred to in modern days as a threat actor. And what's going to happen is they're going to um, try different vulnerabilities. A virus attaches itself to a code or an image or a document. Um, a worm is able to go from one machine to another machine on the network, like we talked about. And then finally, the last is a Trojan horse. Appears to be one thing, but in reality is malicious code. So you might get something that says, hey, I wrote an awesome version of Tetris and I'm giving it away free. So when you run it, maybe it does play a good game of Tetris while it scans your hard drive looking for confidential information, credit card numbers, social security numbers, attempting to access email messages, bad things. A reconnaissance attack is where you do some research and try to go through and discover information. What machines are out there? What services are they running? What version of the operating system are they running? So you can figure out what vulnerabilities that version of the operating system may have. An access attack is where you go through and access the machine and possibly manipulate the data on the machine or user privileges. And then denial of service that we talked about prevents uh, a machine from performing a function properly. So the first one is these are all three reconnaissance attack. The first is referred to as internet queries. So what would happen is you have a bad guy out here, and they're trying to find out information about your company and possibly equipment that you have. So they might use the whois command. I have you use that either in a homework I just assigned or one that I'm going to assign to look information up about a site. Here they're looking at cisco.com and it will give you their address. Sometimes it will tell you the person there who's responsible for that domain name, etc. So they're querying or using an internet tool to look up information about your company. A ping sweep basically goes through and takes a network and will ping like .1, .2, .3, just sequentially go through. This is similar to something that's called war dialing. That's from the movie War Games. War dialing was just going through phone numbers sequentially trying to find computer modems. Ping is going through sequentially to IP addresses trying to find machines that actually respond. So what happens is you have a program that's going to send out the pings, and the machines that are up and running will respond back to that ping, so you know there's a machine at that IP address. And then once you know the IP address, you can try to attack it further. Then, typically after you know the IPs of machines, or you have an particular IP that you want to try to break into, you do port scans, which is for that IP going, is there anything at port 1, port 2, port 3, port 4, and just going through. And this animation will show you that if a port scan is done on a particular machine, you do a lot of queries for different ports, and the ports that answer back, you get a list of those. So on this machine, whatever it is, it has port 22, which is SSH open. It has port 53, which is DNS open. Has RPC bind open. IPP, which is Internet Printing Protocol. And then not really sure what RNDC is, but port 593 is open as well. So this could potentially be a company's DNS server. because they have port 53 open. So from this information, you can maybe take a guess at what operating system it's running and what ports you might be able to attack or look for vulnerabilities on. As far as access attacks, these are trying to gain access to a machine to do, quote, bad things or malicious things. The first one is password attacks. There's different ways you can do this. You can use a program like Crack or John the Ripper and do brute force attacks and try to guess passwords. You can have a Trojan horse that may pop up and say, yeah, this is a really cool game of Tetris, but unfortunately you have to be administrator on the machine to install this. And then pop up a panel like you would see down here that says, give me the administrator password. And then packet sniffers, if you're using, for example, Telnet to do interactive login where information is not encrypted, you can use a packet sniffer. Wireshark is a packet sniffer that monitors network traffic, and in the data that you capture with the sniffer, you may be able to find user IDs, passwords, and other confidential information. Trust exploitation is basically, if you're trying to break into one machine, I can't remember. Okay, so System A trusts System B. So the threat actor is trying to hack into System A, and they are not successful because System A seems to be secured pretty well. But maybe System B is not, and if they break into System B and System A trusts System B, they can exploit that trust to possibly gain access to the system they really want, which is System A. Port redirection, can't remember if we've talked about that yet. Your multifunction device will have port redirection. So if you connect to your router on port 22, for example, in my house, that forwards to my Mac OS X server port 22 so that I can SSH into it. And then once I'm on my Mac server, I can do anything I need in the house. So what they're doing is here they're compromising a machine, and then they're saying if you get a connection on some particular port, then I want you to send it over here to the hacker's laptop or something so that you can look at packets or information that's traversing the network. And then the last kind of access attack is man in the middle. Man in the middle is kind of difficult to set up. But basically what happens is, let's say you have an HTTPS secure communication between this person's laptop and the web server. If the bad guy is able to get the encryption keys, he can intercept packets as they go to and from the web server. He can decrypt the packets, record or inspect the information in the packets, then re-encrypt them and send them to the web server. When the web server sends something back, he can decrypt it, look at the response, re-encrypt it, and send it to the victim's PC. So the victim has no idea anything's going on because this appears to work like it normally would. But the bad guy, the man in the middle, is collecting information that he shouldn't be able to collect. Denial of service attacks, I talked about them early on. Basically, it's trying to flood something. In this example, the bad guy is trying to flood the web server with lots and lots of traffic. So when somebody tries to make a legitimate request of the web server is not going to be able to respond or may be slow. So that's denial of service, preventing a service from working or a person from gaining access to a server. A distributed or DDoS, a distributed denial of service attack, is the same, but you have lots of machines sitting out there waiting to attack. They couple of terms, you have zombies. They're sitting there doing nothing until you tell them to, and you tell them to attack. And often this is called a botnet because you have lots of bots out there basically doing what you want. So the bad guy is evidently upset with QZX Bank. He has some zombies out here. They show two, but in reality, this could be thousands, tens of thousands of compromised computers. And when the bad guy tells them to do something, the denial of service attack is started, and you have multiple machines, again, thousands, tens of thousands attacking, in this case, a bank web server, trying to cause problems. 1625 is a check your understanding on network attacks. You can do that on your own. And then at the end of the section, we have a lab. It's a relatively short lab on researching network security threats. So you can go through and complete that. Again, I don't know that I can say this enough. There are a couple of reflection questions at the end. Anytime you have a reflection question, it's absolutely important that you answer those. Those are the, quote, critical thinking questions, and often are worth more points than other questions that are scattered out through the lab or the packet tracer. Okay, next section is the mitigation. So we've talked about different types of attacks. How can we try to prevent these attacks, basically? So there are lots of different types of devices. You may have a VPN server, firewalls, actual servers, actual host, switches, routers, different types of servers. For example, DNS servers, web servers. And some of these are intended to keep you safe, and then others are things that you need to take action to keep secure, to keep your entire network safe. So in 16.3.1, they call this the defense in depth approach. But basically what it is you secure your network devices first. Then you secure your end devices. And then you look at the operating systems on those end devices next. So firewalls we've talked about. An intrusion, let's talk about an IDS first, something not shown here. There's something called an IDS, which is an intrusion detection system. It monitors network traffic either by a host attached to a network, or here it looks like it's in line, reading a lot of the traffic that's passing through the network from the firewall to the switches and servers to the right. What an intrusion detection system does is it tries to look for bad things. If it determines that there is an intruder or something bad going on, it will report that. It'll send an email, it'll send a page, it'll send a text, may turn a picture of a device red in your network operations center so somebody sees that something's going on. What they've shown here is an intrusion protection system. An intrusion protection system does everything the IDS does that I just described. The only thing is the ending. Once it detects something goes wrong, it fixes the problem instantly and automatically. So it may turn off a port, so a device goes off the network, or it may add a firewall rule to prevent a certain type of traffic. So it's going to proactively take information or take action, to prevent a problem from occurring. If you do get compromised, it is important to have backups so that you can restore the operating system configuration file Anything that was wiped out that you need back, you should have on backups. And you should have talked about backups in 111. But what you need to do is you first need to figure out what needs to back up. You need to determine where you're going to back it up to. You then need to determine what frequency that you're going to do. You also need to determine when you're doing full backups and then when you're doing differential or incremental backups. And then finally, the most important thing at the bottom is if you don't validate that your passwords or your backups are valid, then you don't have a good backup strategy. So here they're talking about they need to be protected with strong passwords. You need to remember that password, but validation to me is more, is the backup valid? Can you pull it back and actually get the information you're trying to protect? The next section, upgrade, update, patch. This can apply to networking equipment as well, but the context they're showing here is a end user device. So periodically there are updates put out to fix bugs, vulnerabilities, security flaws, misfunctioning software of an operating system. So you should get in the habit of applying updates and patches as soon as you can. The upgrade is more what I think about as like, oh, you're running Windows 7. You need to upgrade to Windows 10. Things like that to stay with the most current operating system, which is likely to be more secure. The 3 A's of security, authentication, authorization, and accounting. Authentication is proving you are who you say you are. I taught the Security Plus class, CIT 180 in the past, and on their midterm or the final, I said, what are the 3 major ways to authenticate? And I'll give you a hint. All 3 answers start with something you. So I'll usually ask students what's the most common way that they authenticate, and they will say user ID and password, which is correct. So that's something you know. Another way to authenticate is using, a software authenticator or a hardware authenticator, like an RSA key that has a number, typically a 6-digit number that changes every 2 minutes. And when you go to log in, you may give a user ID and password, and then it may turn around and say, okay, you need to look at your RSA key and tell me the code that is currently being displayed. So that is something you have. A smart card or an RFID card may be used as well. And then the last way to authenticate is something you are. This would be your fingerprint, your palm print, a retina scan, facial recognition, something that's typically referred to as biometrics. So that's authenticating. Some people might think of that as logging in. Authorization is once you prove you are who you say you are, what are you authorized to do, or what are you authorized to access? And then finally, the accounting is this person logged in this date and time from this location, this person logged out this date and time, this person changed this salary in the HR database from this to this on this date and time. So basically keeping track of things that if something goes wrong or you're hacked, you might need to go back and figure out what the hacker or upset employee changed. The next section is talking about firewalls. Basically, you have firewalls a lot of times to protect, the inside, your cloud, your home, your enterprise, your school, whatever is in that cloud, from bad guys on the internet. So basically, the firewall will look at packets. It looks at them both ways, but usually the way you're most concerned about is things coming from the internet to the inside. A lot of times, going from the inside out, there will be a rule that says any, or allow all, which will not block any traffic. But coming from the internet in, depending upon the destination IP, the port address, maybe both, maybe inspecting the packets for what type of content is in the packet. The firewall will decide whether or not to pass that packet. So if it decides that the packet is malicious or possibly malicious in nature, or at least not authorized anyway, it will block that. A lot of times, though, you will have a web server that you sell products on, or maybe it has help documentation, product documentation. So a lot of times you do something called a DMZ. Oftentimes DMZs are built by putting a firewall here and a firewall here and moving the server down. But DMZ is demilitarized zone. If you're in the military or seen military movies, DMZ is something that neither side is supposed to be in. If you don't know a lot about the military, but you're a Star Trek fan, this would be like the neutral zone, an area where nobody is supposed to enter, or at least in this case, access is controlled by the firewall. So somebody trying to come in and buy something from you, they would be allowed to do. But the security to get inside the corporation would be much stricter and much more secure. I alluded to some of this already. There are different types of firewalls. The first is packet filtering, which either based on the destination IP or MAC address decides whether a packet can go through. Application filtering looks at the ports, possibly in combination with IP address, possibly not, to decide whether or not to let you in. URL would be whether or not to allow you to go to certain websites. This is one example where it may be looking more at the outgoing traffic. So you may have websites that you don't want your employees or your students getting to. If your firewall did URL filtering, you could prevent access to those URLs. And then the most complicated but most secure is stateful packet inspection. Basically what happens is the firewall rips open every packet that travels through it and looks at the contents to make sure it's legitimate and to make sure it's part of a conversation that is intended. So if somebody tries to interject packets, or you have what's called unsolicited packets, just packets that are mysteriously appearing, your stateful packet inspection firewall can choose to block those. And these may be denial of service attacks that it's figuring out and attempting to block. And then finally, the last one is endpoint security. That's your desktops, your phones, your servers, your smartphones, your tablets. You need to protect them as well. A couple of ways to protect those is by keeping the operating system software up to date. Another, especially for like smartphones and tablets, is to give a lock code. Your desktop, laptops should have a lock code. And if you're talking about a host that is a Unix, Mac, or Windows operating system, they will have a software firewall that can run on that PC and the firewall is logically right at your NIC card where you would connect the cable in or connect to a wireless access point. So sometimes that's called a host firewall. But running the firewall and keeping your OS up to date and using either password or lock code security are the best ways to deal with endpoint security. 1638 is a check your understanding on mitigating network attacks. You can do that on your own, and we'll move on to device security. A relatively new thing on Cisco devices is something called Cisco Auto Secure. What it's going to do is it's going to disable a lot of IP services that can run on a Cisco router and have in the past started up by default, but are things that you may not really need or think about. So they're trying to change their approach. Instead of all this is available, to shut most or all of it off. And then if you need it, then you have to go in and proactively turn it back on. The other thing you can do is if there's default user IDs and passwords, you should change them immediately. Should be one of the first things you do when you deploy a network device. You should only give accounts and access to resources to the people who really need them. And then this is kind of redundant. This is what Auto Secure is doing, is turning off any unnecessary services or applications. So Auto Secure will help you with that. As far as passwords, we have enable passwords. We have user exec passwords. We may have firmware passwords on our PC. One of the things that you need to do is make sure that you have strong or good passwords. A strong password is one that's going to be hard to attack and figure out. Down here they show you some weak passwords, using your mother's maiden name, your spouse or significant other's name, the name of the car you drive, your pet's name, names and or birthdays, or simple words or combinations of words. These are considered weak passwords because they can be subject to somebody who's trying to do identity theft or phishing and then has gotten some of this information from you, or from something called dictionary attacks, where you just sit there and take words from dictionary, put them together, maybe put some numbers around them, maybe change E's to 3's and things like that, common things people do, and try to brute force break into your account. Down here are some strong passwords because they are kind of random in nature. It's good to have uppercase, lowercase, special characters, numbers, letters from the alphabet if I didn't say that, and the longer they are, the better. Used to, they said 8 characters was enough. Then they moved it to 12, and more recently they're saying 16 because the longer they are, exponentially longer time it takes to brute force break into those. Some additional password security things you can do, for example, on routers by default, passwords are not encrypted. If you're able to do a show running config, you can see the passwords. The other thing is to have minimal acceptable password links and or password rules. Another is if somebody's brute force attacking password after password after password, notice that there are lots of failed login attacks, and detour that brute force attack by disabling the account, maybe indefinitely or more likely for some period of time, like an hour or two, hoping that the person will move on. If they don't move on, it'll still slow them down, If they can only try 7 passwords, then they have to wait 2 hours before they can try 7 more, for an example. And then you can, on host and switches, if somebody should be logging into your switches remotely only between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., you can put rules on that. So down here we have an iOS command line. We talked a long time ago about service password encryption to encrypt the password in our configuration files. Here they're setting the minimum password length to 8. Here they're saying if somebody gives the wrong password 3 times within a minute, block them for 2 minutes. Here they are on your remote lines saying that if you time out because you haven't authenticated for a certain length of time, disconnect that, and it's forcing you to use SSH instead of Telnet. So here they're showing you the running config, and then they're looking at the virtual teletype lines, what you remotely log into, and you'll see that they do have a password set, and it looks like random characters. Kind of already talked about this, but using SSH instead of Telnet, because Telnet is everything goes across the network in clear text. With SSH, everything is encrypted: user ID, password, and your entire session. Here, they're telling you about some other things that you need to do to support SSH. You have to have a unique device name. The device has to have an IP, so it has to have a domain name. So basically, between these two, you have an FQDN, a fully qualified domain name. You then have to, on a device that's going to run a secure shell daemon, you have to generate an encryption key. You then need to make sure there's a user with a password in the local password file. You need to enable inbound SSH, which they're doing down here with transport input SSH. And then once you do all those things, you should be able to SSH to the IP address of this router and get a command line interface like you're plugged into the console port. We already talked about this a little, but disable unused services. The first graphic, show IP ports all, is the current way to do this. Down here at the bottom, show control plane host open ports, is for older versions of iOS. But basically, we'll look at the modern way to do that. Our local machine is listening on port 443, which is the HTTPS, so it has a secure web server. And then it's listening on port 67 for something, DHCPD. So it's providing DHCP services on port 67. Down here, we have Telnet running because this is an older machine or older OS, and we have an HTTP normal web server running on port 80 and the DHCP server. So these would look a little different. What they're doing down here is saying, gee, I don't need a web server running. So let me turn it off and let me force SSH so that people can't Telnet in. You probably should turn off Telnet once you verify that SSH is working correctly. 1646 is a packet tracer on configuring secure passwords and SSH on a network device. I will be assigning this, so watch for it to appear in Blackboard. 1647 is a lab Don't know why it doesn't have the exact same name, but this is basically the same as the packet tracer that I'm going to assign. So I will not be assigning this since we're not an in-person class, but you might still want to read over it very quickly. Going to the end of the chapter, we start with packet tracer 1651, which is on securing network devices. It's relatively short, page and a half, but it's telling you steps to do. So packet tracer 1651 I will be assigning, so watch for that to appear in Blackboard. Here we have a lab that does have the exact same name. It's the exact same lab as the packet tracer I just said I was going to assign. So I will not be assigning this, and you probably do not need to read it because it's the same. What did you learn in this module? Here's a list of quote security things you learned, so look over that. Make sure you're familiar with all that. And then we finish up down here with the Module 16 quiz over the whole module on network security fundamentals. And of course, you will do that on your own. So that finishes up the Module 16 lecture.